Am I really gonna get into this? I guess we're gonna discuss it. So here's the thing. If you've been following the YouTube channel for some time, you probably noticed that I don't really discuss StarCraft 2 balance on this channel all too often, just because it's one of those subjects that, generally speaking, divide people a lot, right? In order to have a strong opinion on balance in the game, you have to actually play the game quite a bit, right? Because otherwise your opinion is probably not gonna be all too accurate. But if you actually play the game a lot, you're always gonna be automatically biased towards whatever race you play in the game. Anyways, a couple of days ago on the live stream, I did sort of get baited into making a list of changes that I would like to see implemented in the game, and I decided to tweet them. Now, generally speaking, whenever I tweet anything, it sort of disappears off of the internet like tweets do within like an hour or two, and nobody really notices it. But this is one of those tweets that got discussed a lot, not just on Twitter, but also on Reddit and in a couple of other places as well. When I first posted this, I didn't really expect it would get a whole lot of traction, but apparently this is an issue that is being discussed actually quite well. I mean, I was expecting a lot more hostility, but all things considered, it seems like a lot of people are looking to improve StarCraft 2 some more. So here's the thing, right? In the past, we would regularly get updates to the balance of the game, and it would make the game overall more exciting. Once a year or so, we would get major balance overhauls that would just sort of shake up the meta, and therefore the game would once again feel fresh, and the games would just be a little bit different. Now, it's been quite some time since we've really had any balance changes to the game. I think the last one was in August 2020, and I wouldn't mind seeing a couple of changes. Now, here's the thing. This list that I originally made is definitely a little bit Zerg biased. As a matter of fact, I believe I created this list right after I lost against Skytos. So, yeah, anyways, over the last couple of days, I've been reading a lot of the responses. I've seen the video that Harston posted with his thoughts as well. I've checked out the Twitter post that Nathaniel made, and I've basically been trying to accumulate a list of changes that I would like to see. And today I would like to present you an updated version of my initial thoughts right over here. I mean, this is something obviously that I've been thinking about for quite some time, but I've never really, made a list like this. All right, so I think the most obvious issue that StarCraft 2 has right now is late game Zerg versus Protoss. I think everyone across the board agrees that it's kind of stupid. From the Protoss' perspective, it's not very fun. From the Zerg's perspective, it's also not very fun. However, this is one of the problems that I personally notice a lot in the late game, and this is not an uncommon situation at the pro level at all. First off, on the right side, we have a lot of carriers, and then we have a lot of Void Rays. This is an army that in order to micro it, you get into the battle by attack moving, and then you activate Prismatic Alignment on the Void Rays. On the left side, we have the Zerg army. That's a lot of Corruptors. Then there's some Vipers here in the mix. I also added a couple of Infestors over here. I have a couple of leftover Ultralisks, and then we have some Queens, right? This is not an uncommon army for the Zerg player at all. Now, if we have these armies fight, so let's have these Protoss units right here attack move towards the other side. If I microed as well, it's probably going to be a victory right here for the Zerg, right? However, it's very easy to accidentally, YOLO in your Vipers like I just displayed. It's very easy to, not target fire right here with the Corruptors. It's very easy to just accidentally lose. Now, at the professional level, if you watch a Serral or a Raynor or a Dark or a Rogue Rider or any of those top-level Zerg players micro these sort of armies, they make Zerg late game look absolutely broken and way too powerful. Whereas if you watch anyone really below the top 20 in the world practice this sort of army or play this sort of army, they will utterly get destroyed, right? So all I did here, I didn't even activate Prismatic Alignment, did I? All I did right here was just attack move with the Protoss army, and it won the battle. All right, so what do I actually suggest to be changed? I'm going to be giving you a lot of values and a lot of numbers. A lot of these numbers I am just simply pulling out of thin air. I didn't test any of them. Meaning that this is something that needs to be adjusted as well going forward. And it's not just a list of changes you can publish straight up in the game. Some of the numbers are going to be absolutely terrible and they won't work out. However, that is obviously something you can give your opinion on as well down below in the comment section. And also, if you see something that you think I should add, let me know. Either way, why do Protoss players in general favor that Skytos army? So first off, it's easy to play, relatively easy to control. Right? Obviously, if you add the Mama ship, you add High Templar, Disruptors, Archons, and all that, it becomes a whole lot more complex, but generally speaking, it's easy to play. But secondly, and this is a really big one, the Protoss ground armies have way more counters than the Protoss air armies. When you think about it, right? So the Zerg late game anti-air armies kind of revolve around the force that I've just shown you, right? You can kind of base it around Hydralisks somewhat as well, but the general base is mostly the same. Whereas against a Groundtoss army, Zerg has loads of options. From just pure Lingbane, Hydra Lingbane, Roach Ravager Lingbane, Hydra Lurker, Brute Lords, even Swarm Host. I mean, the list goes on, especially Lurkers and Brute Lords are a very strong counter to those Protoss ground units. So first off, what do I suggest? This is also something, obviously, that will affect Zerg versus Terran, and this change may be more important for Zerg versus Terran than Zerg versus Protoss, just because most of those Protoss late games currently are all about the Skytoss army. Either way, I think that Lurker Speed Burrow is way too quick. Adaptive Talents, that's an upgrade you can get for the Lurker, currently reduces the Lurker burrow speed from 2 seconds to 0.7. I think it should go to 1 second or maybe 1.2 seconds, so you can't readjust Lurkers nearly as quickly. And secondly, I think that Lurker damage output is too high for the amount of range they have. I think you should nerf the damage to something else. I think it should be a little bit lower. Why do I not suggest nerfing the range? I think the range is what makes the Lurker pretty cool, and especially with the interaction with the Ghost that I'll get to in a little bit, I think leaving it at 10 range is probably good enough, but I think a damage nerf as well as a burrow speed nerf is more than okay. Next up, in order to increase more variety in the early game of Zerg versus Protoss in particular, but this will also help in Zerg versus Terran, is to reduce the Queen anti-air range by 1. So in the past it used to even be 8, but I suggest changing it from 7 to 6. This will allow Warp Prism openers, for example, Dark Templar Prism openers into Archon drops a whole lot more. This will also make Oracle starts a little bit more viable. It will indirectly maybe even buff things like Phoenix openers as well. And while it will affect Zerg versus Terran too, especially when it comes to, like, for example, just early game defense, right? Like, pretty much all the early game defense is dealt with the Queen. I think the Queen is way too well rounded. It's really the only tool that you need in the earlier stages of the game, especially against Terran. I've been thinking about other Queen nerfs as well, but I think that this one makes the most sense just because it addresses the main problem that they have. I mean, when you think about it, the Queen is by far the best Zerg unit. It doesn't cost any larva, it doesn't cost any gas, you can get it after a spawning pool. It's strong in the mid game, it's strong in the late game, it's strong in the early game, it's strong at every pace in the game. It has like the most OP spell casting as well. I don't think the Queen can really escape a nerf. So I suggest nerfing the range right here and therefore allowing some more variety in the early game openers as well. Yeah, I think that's more than fair. A buff that I do suggest for Zerg is Microbial Shroud. So currently, as I said, most of the Zerg armies, especially in the late game, revolve around the Corruptor. I think one of the reasons why is that Microbial Shroud is just simply not that strong. Currently, it's an area that you cast Microbial Shroud in, and it's almost like an indication of you should use your Storm right over here or send your Purification Novas into where that cloud is located. I think making it stick to a unit like Parasitic Bomb, and then if that unit were to die, it like sort of just, you know, hangs out there until the duration is up. I think that would make it quite a bit better already, and I think it's a relatively elegant buff that would make it slightly more powerful. Next up. I think the spellcasters for Zerg in general are too powerful. When I think of spellcasters in the game in general, I think of units that support an army. I don't think of units that, like, are the army, right? So, for example, like the Brute Lord Infestor era that we had in the past, it was horrible. The Infestor was just simply way too strong. First off, Viper Abducts have a 1-second cooldown. This might be a little bit much, but it would certainly allow a little bit more flexibility when you overextend. One of the problems right now when you make a miscontrol or you don't pay attention to your army for a split second, there's a good chance Vipers will come in and abduct everything, and then it's game over, pretty much. I think it's a little bit too strong, and I think Vipers in general have too much strength. The same can be said for the Infestor. I think the Infestor also should be a supplemental unit and not a core unit. So I think that Neural Parasite should not be casted from Burrowed, even though there have been some cool moments recently with Dark, for example, sneaking into a Terran army and then using the Ghost's ability to EMP, you know, the other Ghost. That was pretty sick. Maybe these are like changes I'm not 100% sold on, but I do think that overall, the Vipers and especially Infestors make up too much of a core army, and I don't think they should be. Now, yesterday, I watched Harstem's video, his response to my list of patch notes. And I've been thinking about it a lot over the last, I want to say, 18 hours or so. In that video, he agrees with most of the points I've made. But in that video, he suggests, rather than buffing the Brute Lord as well as the Battlecruiser to be more in line with the what's it called, the Carrier, he suggests just nerfing the Carrier really hard and then also nerfing the Brute Lord itself. The idea being that the game is going to be a little bit more mid-game focused, because when you think about it, generally speaking, when the game gets to the late game, the pacing of it slows down a lot, and in general, it just becomes a little bit less exciting to play, but also a little bit less exciting to watch. The late game generally is not as good as the mid-game and the early game. So he in that video suggested nerfing both the Carrier into the ground as well as the Brute Lord some, and the more I think about it, the more I like that idea. So I've taken a complete 180. Originally, I suggested buffing the Brute Lord, but I actually think Brute Lord from 4 supply to 6 supply total. So this is, you know, obviously also calculating in the cost of the Corruptor and all that. I think that upping the supply of the Brute Lord in general is good. Right now, the Brute Lord is in a position where you don't really want to get any more than 8 of them. And this will probably make it so you don't really want more than like, well, you can still get 8 obviously if you want to, but you could probably get away with a couple less. I think that would be cool. Brute Lords would this way become a lot more in line with, for example, the Battlecruiser, right? Which we see every once in a while, and when you actually get them out, they can be really strong. It's just that it's a big commitment and kind of hard to pull off. And this will obviously only really work with the other changes that I'm also suggesting. Next up, I would like to see a slight buff to the Hydralisk. I mean, this is slight, but it's very substantial. This might be too much. Hydraling Bane fights might become a little bit too powerful, but currently the Hydralisk is a bit of a strange unit. Most of the time we see it mostly as a unit that has to morph into a Lurker, and then as like a supplemental unit. I would like to make it more of a core unit, but this might be where my Zerg bias comes into the mix. So take this for what it's worth, but I would like to see more Hydra play, because currently it just kind of is a stepping stone. You can kind of morph it into a Lurker, and then you don't really want that many Hydras anymore. I mean, you can make Hydras, obviously, but I think maybe 5 HP, or maybe a slight attack speed buff or something along those lines would be fun. And then the last one that I think is the most elegant solution I can come up with for the Ultralisk, reduce the Ultralisk size by 10 to 20%. The idea behind this is to make the Ultralisk a more reliable unit. Currently, once they get into the battle, they deal a lot of damage, but they spend the majority of their lives trying to get into the battle, because they get stuck on Zerglings, they get stuck on Banelings, they get stuck on everything. Previously, I used to think that maybe allowing the Ultralisk to move over Zerglings and Banelings to be a better choice. Like for example, the way that the Colossus likes to walk around. The problem with that is that it's probably way too strong. So I think reducing the Ultralisk size instead, and whether or not the number is 10%, 12%, 50%, I don't know what the number is. But basically make the Ultralisk a little bit more reliable so it doesn't die so easily. All right, so those are the list, or the changes right here that I would like to make to the Zerg. Let's actually go with Protoss first. In my other document that I have on my second monitor, I have Terran next, but I'm gonna go ahead and discuss Protoss first. All right. So first off, remove High Templar water balloons. I saw a lot of confusion about this one in particular. The water balloons of the High Templar always seemed like a bit of a strange addition to the game. So once upon a time, High Templar did not have an auto attack, meaning that whenever you attack moved your whole army forward, so you selected the all army hotkey and you did an attack moved forward, the High Templar would just sort of wander to its death. Very slowly, it would just sort of move around and die. These days, however, they will start throwing these, like, essentially water balloons that don't really deal any damage whatsoever, but they make it so that it's not... Yeah, it's not just gonna die very, very easily, right? So the idea behind this is that either all spellcasters should have it, so including the Ghost, including the Raven, including the Infestor, including the Viper, including whatever spellcaster you can really come up with, or the High Templar shouldn't have it. I always thought it was a bit strange that only the High Templar had it, and I think it's kind of dumb, especially with how easy that late game army already is to control. Yeah, it just seems kind of silly. Secondly, 2 changes to the Void Ray. Originally, I suggested only 1, but Harstem thinks that they should be nerfed like 17 times over. So I'm gonna go sort of, you know, meet them halfway there. I suggest that the Void Ray build time is gonna be reverted. So once upon a time, back in August 2020, if I'm not mistaken, the Void Ray was buffed 3 times. So first off, it had a base movement speed increase, it had a cost reduction, and then a build time decrease as well, which was a little bit silly. I don't know why they decided to like triple buff it. I suggest reverting the Void Ray build time to its old value, and reverting also the base movement speed, but not Flux Veins. So with Flux Veins, it will still have its maximum speed from, I think, 3.85 right now to 3.5, meaning that it's not going to be as slow. Or, yeah, it's not going to be as fast, and it's going to be a little bit slower. This is mostly noticeable when you're forced to split up your queens, or, for example, your Hydras. Say there's like a map where like you're in a triangle position. The queens have to wander around awkwardly, whereas the Void Rays can go from base to base and just sort of destroy everything. It's one of the hardest things to do. Again, the pro level players don't really seem to have any issues with it, but everyone below that level is getting destroyed. So, yeah, I think that reverting the base speed back down is not a bad idea. All right, secondly, I think the fact that you can use battery overcharge in several occasions, multiple times per fight, is stupid. I think they should increase the cooldown. I don't know to what number, but currently oftentimes you can start the battle with a battery overcharge, and then you can also end the battle with a battery overcharge. I think that's a little bit silly, and I don't think that should really be the case, because it's such a powerful skill. I feel like using it once might be a better choice. Secondly, I think that shield battery should probably start with like 25% less energy. So this is specifically to address the cheeses that I know a lot of people are dying to. Again, bundled here with the Void Ray changes, this might be a little bit much. So maybe go with one of the two rather than both. But I think shield battery starting with less energy would make sense, especially in those like offensive Void Ray proxies, or, you know, even Tempest transitions that we see from there every once in a while. The fact that the shield batteries start with full energy is a little bit silly. Right now, though, we see, obviously, with battery overcharge, you can still use it even when the shield battery is out of energy. We usually see the shield batteries timed appropriately anyway, to the point where they would have full energy by the time that an actual battle begins. So I don't think this would really address timing attacks too much, but it would make cheeses slightly less powerful. All right, now this one is one of the changes that I've seen a lot of very positive responses to. Observers can be built from the Nexus once a robo facility is built. I think this is a really cool change that I think makes a lot of sense. One of the reasons why robo play is difficult is because of the fact that it's hard to actually build all of the things at once. The Observers, they share build time with the Immortal, with the Prism, with the Colossus, with all of those units, right? And it just makes it difficult to actually decide what you want to be building. Obviously, right now, it would share build time with the Probe, so you would have to cut a Probe in order to be able to make an Observer, but I think it would be fine. I don't think it would be too powerful. Maybe there's going to be some killer Immortal Sentry sort of push where normally you would hit, like, you know, 15 seconds later because of the Observer and stuff. Maybe it's going to be a little bit too much, but I think this would be a cool change, and it's going to make things way more reliable. Originally, I even suggested making Observers cost no supply. Because if you've ever played any Protoss, you know how blind you are for the majority of the game. Like, Terran has scans basically infinitely in the late game, or at least that's what it seems like. Zerg has creep spread, and they can see the entire map combined with Overlords. Protoss is just sort of sitting there, and you have to be a lot more active about it. I think Observers built from the Nexus, and maybe even costing 0 supply would be fine. I mean, they're still 75 gas each, so they're pretty expensive, but maybe costing 0 supply would be a little bit too much. Either way, I think being able to build them from the Nexus would be a reasonable buff. Next up, another addition that I would like to make. Reduce Archon size so they don't get stuck as much. I've seen a lot of Protoss players complain about this ever since I suggested the notes. Right now, if you have like a gap in your wall, Stalkers can fit through, Immortals can usually fit through, Zealots obviously, Adepts, all of those units can fit through. However, the Archon gets stuck all the time. I don't think you need to actually reduce the unit size itself, but just like however it works in the game design, so it doesn't have to, you know, get stuck on stuff nearly as easily, because it's kind of derpy. I mean, not nearly as derpy as the Ultralisk, but Protoss obviously builds walls way more than Zerg does, and yeah, I think it's a much bigger issue. Once again, not something that really will impact pro-level play at all, but it will make the game a little bit more user-friendly. I also suggest making the Colossus a little bit better overall. Once upon a time, the Colossus was very strong against everything, and then Blizzard changed it to the point where it's like more of a reliable light damage dealer. So the idea being that the Immortal is the reliable anti-armor unit, and then the Colossus is the anti-light unit, right? So you kind of make the both of them, and then you have a really cool army. I think in general, Colossi, they don't get built nearly as often as they once did. Disruptors seem to steal most of the spotlight these days, and this would make them a little bit more powerful, particularly against... well, for example, Marauders, but then also Roaches, Ravagers, that sort of thing. So I think this would make it, yeah, probably a little bit better. Might be a bit much. Maybe it's unnecessary. I also suggested a Phoenix buff in my original list of changes, just because I think Phoenixes are really cool and we don't really see them nearly as often anymore as we used to once upon a time. But maybe that's also a little bit much. So I'm not exactly sure about these, but at the very least, I think it's worth experimenting with. Secondly, 2 nerfs to the carrier, and I've discussed these with Hearthstone, okay? So if you get angry at me, just know that you're also getting angry at Hearthstone, okay? So I suggested to Hearthstone increasing the carrier supply from 6 to 8, which he says is good. But then he also suggests Interceptor's attacks not being as powerful. So the way that it works right now is that every carrier has 8 Interceptors, and Interceptors, they fly... you know, around the carrier, and then they deal 1 damage, right? Like, they deal damage with every single attack. The problem is every Interceptor attacks from both sides at once. So every attack upgrade you get in the Cybercore for the Interceptor doesn't just give each of the 8 Interceptors per carrier plus 1 damage, but effectively plus 2 damage per attack, because just like Phoenixes, it shoots from both sides at once. I suggest merging those upgrades together, so carriers do not benefit from those upgrades nearly as much as they used to, and this will make carriers pretty shitty. Together with Brute Lords that will be, you know, pretty shitty too, and Battle Cruisers that are already pretty shitty. Hopefully that will create more of a dynamic in the mid game, and then hopefully some less focus on the late game. I have already seen quite a few games recently where, I think this was especially Neep, was skipping carriers altogether and was going for a lot of Tempest play rather than carriers. So I don't think it's destroying Skytools altogether, but yeah, if it's too much, obviously go with one of the two. Alright, then we have Terran. I actually think, for the most part, Terran is in a pretty good spot, but I do want to suggest a couple of changes overall. First off, back in the day, we used to see both Terran Bio and Terran Mech equally. We used to see Terran Bio as well as Terran Mech a lot. I thought it was very cool. These days, it's pretty much all Bio army. So what I mean with Bio is infantry-based. So Marine Marauder, Medevac into, you know, all of the other things as well, right? I suggest... Assault Mode Vikings deal +2 damage to biological. I don't know if this is enough. The problem is, right, so here's the thing. Even like someone like Gumiho is playing mostly bio right now, which is, you know, probably a good indication. One thing I do also want to note, actually, is that maybe this is something that will be resolved by the meta as it changes over time. Because I have seen a bunch of games recently from Maru where he starts with Marine Marauder Medevac Mine, then transitions into Ghosts, and then from Ghosts... once he's got like 20 of them, he stops making biological unit and he transitions towards like siege tanks and Thors and all that instead. So maybe this is something that the meta will figure out by itself. Anyways, I was thinking Assault Mode Vikings in particular. So Assault Mode Vikings are the landed versions of the Vikings. I've always thought that that was one of the coolest things they could do, but also one of the most pointless things they can do in the game. We don't really see it at all. I mean, we see it in like desperate scenarios, right? And obviously... it does come into the mix, but I do think there could be a little bit more, or they could use a little bit more love. I think Assault Mode Vikings will probably make things a little bit easier to transition to, but I don't know if this is really truly enough. I think tweaking for example, the Cyclone is very difficult. I think tweaking the Siege Tank or the Thor or any of those core units is very difficult to do just because that would change everything. Whereas Assault Mode Vikings, I think, are a little bit underutilized, and I would like to see them more. I don't know if this is really gonna make mech more viable, but I would like to think that it does. Alright, next up. This is, I think, one of the changes that Nathaniel suggested. Liberators now benefit from Smart Servos. Smart Servos is an upgrade you can get that allows the units to transform from one version to the next more quickly. Yeah, I think Liberators being able to reposition themselves a little bit quicker might be okay. I do think Liberators are already very strong. And maybe combined here with the Viper Abduction nerf, this might be a bit much, especially in Terran versus Zerg. But I do think it's something worth experimenting with. And obviously the value might not be as quick as these other units. I think right now, I don't know exactly what the value is of these changes and what the exact numbers are, how long it takes for a liberated transition from anti-ground to anti-air. But I think it would be something that they should benefit from, because it just makes sense. Because we don't really see the upgrade very much, and it's cool. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot is shifting power away from the Ghost. So here's the thing. I think late game Terran is actually very strong, but nerfing the Ghost straight up is probably not possible. Originally, I suggested a Ghost HP nerf, but thinking about it more, I'm not entirely convinced that that is the best choice to make. I think that, like, here's the thing. I think they're balanced, but also too strong at the same time, if that makes any sense. So late game Terran is definitely very strong, but it's mostly based around the Ghost, and I would like to see some other units maybe get into the mix as well. So maybe someone has a suggestion for this. Let me know down below again. I suggested shifting power from the Ghost to the Raven maybe somehow. Not exactly sure how you would pull this off and not completely break the game. But I do think that Ghosts, like Queens for example, are too well-rounded and have a little bit too much power. Thors. Anti-air range from the Thor from 11 to 10. And buff their base armor from 1 to 2. I think that Thors right now... So once upon a time they had 10 anti-air range and Brute Lords effectively had like 12. Then they changed the Brute Lord anti-ground range to 10. And at the same patch, or in the same patch, also the Thor's anti-air range from 10 to 11. Only in the high impact mode. Basically what I'm getting at, because these are a lot of numbers, is that in the past, Brute Lords used to counter Thors, but now Thors sort of counter Brute Lords. I think if you reduce their range to be even, right? So Brute Lords currently are at 10 range. I think making Thors also at 10 range would probably be fine. Not exactly sure about the buffing from the armor as well, because this might be a little bit too much. But this is something that Nathaniel suggested, and I do think it's a cool idea to experiment around with it. I would like to see some more Thor openers again and stuff. That was fun. Maybe this might make them a little bit too strong. I'm not exactly sure. Another thing I would like to see more often used is Hyperflight Rotors. That's the Banshee speed upgrade. We don't really see it used pretty much ever. I don't know if reducing the upgrade cost by itself is going to be enough. But I do think it would be fun to see that ability a little bit more regularly. I think if you're going to start messing around with like not requiring tech labs, which I see some people suggesting, or reducing the build time of the Banshee altogether, that would make them way too powerful and way too common in the early game. Because right now they're kind of competing with Liberators, and I think that's pretty cool. Anyways, Hyperflight Rotors, cost reduction might make it played a little bit more often. Whether or not the value is 125, 125, or 100, 100, I do not know. But I do think it would be fun to see a little bit more often. And this is another change that I've seen a couple of people suggest. Ghost steady targeting from 170 damage to 120 damage, but can no longer be interrupted. And maybe also make it so that it doesn't take as long to cast. So right now I think it's 1.43 seconds to cast. 1.43 seconds to cast. Maybe make this like 1.25 or something along those lines. So it's a little bit more reliable to get it off. So currently Ghosts get interrupted when they take damage while they're doing their little lineup ability. This would like no longer allow them to be interrupted. Alright. So there's the full list. How bad did I do? I think this is pretty good. I think this addresses most of the changes, but keep in mind, I'm a Zerg player myself for the most part, so it's probably going to be a little bit Zerg biased. That being said, I do think this addresses the majority of the problems. So first off, Protoss versus Zerg build order variety. I think the Robo change, the Observer change that is going to make things a little bit easier. I think the Colossus also might make, you know, building those a little bit better. I think the Void Ray nerf overall, it's not going to completely, you know, make them no longer viable, but I do think it makes other options look a little bit more potent, especially with the Queen anti-air range reduction too. I mean, you might want to open up Oracles, you might want to open up Prism with DT drops a little bit more regularly. Next up, I think this definitely changes the way that Protoss can transition from a ground army into a late game grind army a little bit better, because the Brute Lord is nerfed as well as the Lurker is nerfed. At the same time, it also makes the late game Skytools transition less enticing, primarily because of the fact that carriers simply are much worse, but on the flip side, obviously, Brute Lord also got quite a bit weaker because of it. I think that sounds pretty good to me, but maybe I'm missing something. Secondly, Or I guess, you know, this is Protoss versus Zerg specifically, and like 2 problems in Protoss versus Zerg, the late game and the build order variety. I also think this will make mech a little bit more viable, and hopefully it changes the power around a little bit for Terran to not be as reliant on ghosts. That being said, I do think there's one more change here that's missing, and I'm not exactly sure what it is. I've been thinking about it a lot. How would you make the late game of Terran not as dependent on the ghost, but without breaking it completely in the mid-game? Maybe someone has a suggestion. Again, let me know down below in the comment section. All right, now, here's the thing, though. All of the changes here I'm suggesting are not just things you can implement in the game and then call it a day. This is something that could be implemented into the game to hopefully make it better. Maybe not everything, maybe take a couple of things from this and combine it with other people's lists. I don't really care. The problem is that this will need to have further adjustments as well. Because if you implement this right now, if you implement the list, say for example, as is right now straight into the game, it's gonna come up with some glaringly obvious mistakes. Like for example, I don't know, I'm suggesting a 10 HP Hydralisk buff. Maybe Hydraling Bane pushes are gonna be way too powerful, and that's all that Zerg will ever do going forward. What I'm getting at is that this will require active development from Blizzard. You probably see where I'm getting at. Yeah. Anyways, I hope that there's still gonna be a patch for the game. At this point, I'm not 100% sure.